specific areas, please feel free to do that and bring it up so that we tee up those conversations. Like for example, chemical sector. Last year, my Easter started off with a chemical sector email, business email compromise that went into a very deep down exercise of where those chemical company have, or that chemical company had those, their geographical locations and why they got the real business will compromise the way they got it. And then, so some of that are examples, right, that we really maybe are not thinking of, and then we want to discuss and make sure that other areas get the same attention. Some of them are quite mature, and many of them are actually not, which is probably the norm of the day. So this discussion I wanted to kick off with kind of identifying what probably, a couple of us talk about specific areas that they are involved in on the critical infrastructure side. Again, think out of the box, which areas you have deep expertise on that you can bring, but also the areas that are not getting attention, the same attention that and having the ISACs and ISAOs representation here, you can bring the lens of where you're getting engagement and where we're not, and how can we uplift that collaborative defense together, and not just as people and industries, but also the multiple sectors that are connected. Anyone wants to go first here in this round? Okay. If you're not, then I'll just pick one, Denise. Oh, Dave, go for it. Because as much as Charles claims to start, it's actually also Denise has quite a bit of hand in that. Yeah. Okay, Dave, go ahead, please.
Yeah, and thanks so much for leading the dialogue again. It's great to see everyone in person again and visit many of those who I haven't seen since our last Davos visit. My name is Bill Ops with Blue Water International. We're growth advisors and investors in cybersecurity companies. Our managing partners have been in business for about 30 years. We work with policy leaders and network with organizations like this, which are so important to collaborate and to support our portfolio and our teams. On the critical infrastructure side, we have portfolio companies who are addressing that from a defense and from a supply chain perspective. As we've been doing this for a long time, and I can remember one of my first investigations in this space following criminal activity was around the Citibank hack of '94. Vladimir Levin, a Russian group, hacked into Citibank, and that kind of put cybersecurity on the public mindset. And I think Citibank was actually the first company to coin the CISO role at that time. And we feel like we're playing whack-a-mole. I think all of us do. One of our portfolio companies from about 12 years ago on the law enforcement side was working around those organizations which are similar in the critical infrastructure side who can't afford to pay for their own cyber defenses or don't have sophisticated cyber leadership just because they don't have the budget to do that. And so much of our national critical infrastructure falls into that space with utilities, with electrical energy, in these rural areas that are connected into our larger grid that don't have those defenses or education. So our company, which ran a police training program nationally, saw how do we help them support those organizations who can't afford it themselves, and law enforcement nationally, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, identified that these criminals physical criminals were taking that path of least resistance, and they were moving their criminal organizations into these rural pockets where they didn't have the sophistication or the funding to defend them. And there was human trafficking, there were cyber programs, there were a variety of issues that were flying under the radar. So they created, through policy, the RPI, the Rural Policing Institute, and they provided funding for those that couldn't afford it. Every police department of a certain size, of a certain economic standard, to be provided this training. So we were able then, through our portfolio company, to go in and offer our training to these companies for free. And so I can see something similar, and this could fall into the cyber help desk categories and fall into many of our individual companies or portfolio companies opportunities, is to support a funding initiative that will allow the critical infrastructure organizations in the country who don't have the means to provide cyber security resilience on their own to be able to have it through a provision of training and of supplies and services that they couldn't get otherwise. I think that a policy initiative led by individuals that are in this room right now could be supportive in helping that type of program take place. And we did learn, because the organizations and this RPI our previous company was supporting was very data to show the success and the value that these communities were getting from this, and the success that they were having in taking down, stopping criminal activity. That we could provide something similar.
Right. I mean, the learning from the physical law enforcement side to cyber law enforcement side is definitely something that needs to be bridged, can be learned from, and can be applied. Probably starting from the national level and then global, right? Because the law enforcement community is kind of already tied up with what they're doing, right? And all of these cases that are out that come, you probably, Dave, you remember that we did this forensics lab at UNC Frisco, and that was just an example, because the whole law enforcement community is seeing that for every case there is a device, mobile device, more than one mobile device that's out there, and they were backed up for like 9-12 months of caseloads that they couldn't do. So we created a forensics lab where the law enforcement team can come in, and it was CG certified, so they could extend what they're doing formally within and extend that to a more academic setting, but still get the same outcome and results. So absolutely great point. Mark, you want to go next?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, I think a really important point there is the mid-sized organization, right? The organization is big enough to understand and take action on information that's provided to them. I think it's mid-sized organizations, small, it takes a really tough. But there's, in manufacturing alone, like there's hundreds of thousands of mid-sized organizations in the United States. And in any of the critical infrastructure sectors, like you mentioned, energy, same thing. You have a lot of these regional, small organizations that don't have any resources dedicated to cybersecurity. So how do you manage that? Is it through some kind of a government program, some kind of funding program, or is it through in manufacturing, through like the supply chain, and maybe find the large manufacturers that can help support the supply chain and smaller manufacturers, information sharing among them, or ensuring their cybersecurity services. So the large manufacturer takes that, or makes it part of the let's say defense grant. It has to be part of that grant proposal that don't include the cybersecurity focus. So how do you build that into the framework? How do you build that into things that incentivize a mid-sized organization to care about this?
Yeah, I think that discussion flows from also what we had in the morning, that there's in financial services we said 1%, and then the rest 99%. How do they scale up the response? Sometimes they just know and admit that they can't do anything about it, and how do you raise that capability across the board? Any other thoughts?
I mean, so I don't know how. I think it's an evolution, and I can talk a little bit about the ISACs too, because the ISACs are set up around critical infrastructure. So the DHS has had various 16 sectors, went up to 18, now it's down to 16. And basically what they did was in 1998, under President Clinton, they asked industry to come together to share information with each other across the sectors and with the government. Financial services was the first to stand up and said it's like a good idea, and they did it. And they've been around for over 20 years. Many ISACs have been around for over 20 years. And we actually collaborate with the National Council of ISACs, which has been around, it'll be 20 years next year. So that's a volunteer body. We've grown from a very small cadre of people to 27 ISACs now. And there's a reason why we've become very successful and we've stayed the course, and that's because there's value. And basically, I think a lot of the focus has been, over time, followed threat actor focus. So for example, in health wasn't even one of the national critical functions. It wasn't part of the lifeline sectors. And in actually 2010, we weren't even talking about cybersecurity in healthcare. But when we had in 2016, the attack, the ransomware attack against Hollywood Presbyterian, and people realized, oh, it's not just about data privacy and HIPAA, it's also about patient safety and lives. And you can't deliver healthcare services. And then the threat actors realized, oh my God, they need to deliver healthcare services, so they're going to pay anything to be able to come back on. And so that, and now we see the focus in healthcare. Likewise with COVID. 2 years ago, we weren't even on the radar screen. And with COVID, when health basically shut the world economy and the world operations down, they were like, oh my God, we need to pay attention to health. So I think, and water is another one that never gets brought up, but water is critical to everything. Electricity. And so, and many of those are very small rural utilities that don't have cyber capabilities, weren't even focused on cyber because they were physical, right? And so, it's been an evolution over time as the threat actors come into those spaces, and now you see them moving into the OT space because devices have been connected to the internet that never used to be. That now people are like, oh, we need to pay attention. So I think again, it's that focus, that vision, that mindset of thinking about what do I need to be, what do I need to do to protect myself so that I am resilient. And that's not just unique to your organization, but it's to the whole ecosystem, because as brought up earlier, you don't have electricity, you don't have water, you don't have transportation, you're going to be brought down the road. So.
Yeah. And I think the expansion of the same level of maturity from the leading actor or leading sectors to those that are lagging, needs to be done in a more accelerated manner. Also, I think there are foundational frameworks that could be used across the board. One thing that comes to my mind is from aviation way that was pretty much, there's a lot of security protocols that are already there. Funny when I remember about the fact that the TSA is the regulator for oil and gas, and that created a completely new maelstrom last year. When the Colonial Pipeline happened, and of course that did put in the radar, on the common man's radar, what would happen, whether it was intentional or not, right? I mean, the actions were two different type of actions that followed each other. One ransomware action followed by the executive action of the business taking some steps that they took with their understanding of what would be the impact, right? And that chain of chain reaction that categorized, I think, brought us to a different light. But I think, when it comes to the critical infrastructure sector, some of these are highlighted, some of them are not, and it'd be good to see how we can share more in this space. Yeah.
Well, I'm going back to tie workforce into this piece of it, because a lot of in critical infrastructure, a lot of them, again, are the bigger ecosystem where one entity kind of really helps out and supports another. It's part of a broader ecosystem. And so, like for example, healthcare, and I'll just take an example in Canada, Ontario Health is part of a broader ecosystem where then under them and where they help and support are like care providers and insurance and others, but then healthcare overall. And so can we look from where they need support for people? I know they can always afford, or it comes down to budgets, but then it's can the funding go into creating specialized training for say the entry level to be able to be then deployed into that ecosystem of critical infrastructure, and then they have that specialized training and skill sets to help support, then they can get funding to pay. So they're almost like contractors coming in. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to deconstruct each tower of critical infrastructure into how they operate differently to go from financial services, the big banks versus the whole chain of command that's there, right? Origination, there is, banking financial services itself is quite a heterogeneous construct. Then if you go to healthcare, you have the payer, provider, and then the services industry that supports it. There are also intermediaries that flow the money and have different levels of maturity. So even if a hospital gets attacked and goes down with ransomware issue, how are the others can come bring their services to ensure that the hospitals, which in fact their clients, can support them. From the energy sector, again, looking at the oil and gas operates differently versus PNU operates differently, and the energy transfer companies, which are literally PE owned, operate completely differently. Case in point that, say for example, oil and gas is typically a global business. And now when more attention being brought to it because of the Russia-Ukraine war, when you shut down the gas and then also you attack the national grids of those countries, and probably our friend here can talk about it a little bit more in depth. We'll go to the cyber war peace conversation and look at it in that angle. But that's what we're defending, which typically are operations that are global in the oil and gas piece. You have the super majors, 4 or 5 of them. Super majors, probably 4. Valero doesn't count at this point as a super major, but still they claim to. Then you have the oil field services, which provide global services and have global infrastructure. And their exit from Russia was extremely hard. And literally when we shut down, the infrastructure was taken over by Russian operatives. It was hard. And then coming back to the PNU side, which is very domestic in nature. Typically, there's cross-border grids that share in a different way, and there is a physical aspect to that too, because you're confined by geographies where you can share, right? And that all diminishes when you talk to energy transfer companies. Energy transfer companies are basically more on the green tech side. You've got wind, you've got solar, you've got geothermal, and several other areas which are owned by PE companies, and they manage it differently because they're all portfolios typically under $1 billion or $2 billion. They don't have that level of maturity of cybersecurity, and now they're being acquired by the super majors, which expect a level of maturity which is not there. It's probably not right to say that a super major has a level of maturity. If you look at comprehensively, they may have some processes, but at least the assets that they're buying now through the energy transfer acquisitions, it's very hard. It's also new type of assets, right? The ones that have been traditionally in the energy space have been more brick and mortar, have been more, have OT and industrial control system, which are 15, 20 years old, need to be different in a certain way. Whereas the acquisitions that are coming from the energy transfer space, especially the solar and wind and those areas, they're digitized. And sometimes you can, the consumer has access how they use that energy and from where it flows. So it's very important to understand, and I think spread the awareness of and knowledge of how within those 16 sectors, how they operate differently, and where can we tap into the institutional knowledge of the industry, and also share with institutional knowledge, kind of current entities of the legacy players, the new ways of doing things, because they're acquiring assets that are, inherently more exposed when it comes to cyber risk. So, some of those examples I think need to be well thought out, because a lot of the institutional knowledge is within certain sectors of critical infrastructure. So the next thing that I wanted to kind of bring about is the interconnectivity of these sectors. One example is transportation, right? In transportation is, as much as we talk about electric vehicles and connected cars and all that stuff, transportation and the critical infrastructure and support ecosystem for that has been, connected to the law enforcement piece from a long time ago, especially the EMS part, right? Energy, the emergency management systems, including the 9/11 network, all of that. Even though it's not as mature, but it's very fairly consistent. You can expect a certain amount of result of calling a 911, getting an answer back, right? So I think the connectivity of that. So that's where I think our knowledge and from certain sectors which are ahead into getting to other sectors which need to catch up comes into play. Any comments on that? I mean, knowledge sharing across sectors. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I'm Teza, I'm the C-SWAG charge point. You know, we're kind of going back to your point and Isaac's point. We are between the grid and the connected car. Cars show up, EVs show up in our stations, and we help charging them either through RFID or cert exchange, different ways. Again, so some of this critical infrastructure, it's not there yet, but I think EV charging is on path to be a critical infrastructure. But we go to Auto Isaac and they say, you're a provider, so you cannot join Auto Isaac. So we are in this middle of them where there's no Isaac yet, but we want to get this information from different agencies.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, that's what
You're not that person. I think can make some moves happen.
But charging does not allow us to go there. So it's for the evolution has to be to look at what are the new infrastructure players that are coming and how does it impact our critical infra? How do we make sure there's more information sharing? Something like that.
So just to play on that, and that's one of the reasons why Global Business Federation exists, is to fill that white space in information sharing. The organizations that don't get qualified for critical infrastructure, because sometimes they're very specific about the topics they cover, very specific about the organizations they allow them as well. And so we have this Business Resilience Council, which is a sort of catch-all right now for any organization that doesn't fit into one of these other areas. And organically, as we get organizations within a specific sector or subsector, we can create connectivity to existing ISACs, or we can create connectivity with just groups, collaborative groups within those subsectors as part of that organization. So that's kind of a catch-all for enterprises that don't fit into critical infrastructure, for supporting organizations, etc. And we've done that. There's also, within existing ISACs that we manage, we also figure out ways that we can connect affiliate organizations as well. We emphasize that I'm sure we do that as well.
I was going to say, even electricity, I think it's more in the United States, so that might be another avenue.
Yeah, because at this point you're coming to the distribution side, right? I mean,
we upstream, it could be solar, it could be wind,
Right.
it could be the classic, utilities, and downstream it's the vehicle. So we are only like the middle.
you are in the middle. Yeah, both. I think financially also in the same manner, right? You got generation, you got transmission, you got distribution, and you're right in the middle of that transmission distribution endpoint where the money is moving from commercial
But
from
the thing
commercial.
is, when the new presidential directive or a lot of laws are the agencies, the federal agencies are sitting on 10 billion cash to be spent into putting in new EV infrastructure. There's a lot of compromises being made on the quality of stuff that's coming into and becoming part of our infrastructure. And these go into the ground. They stay there for 20 plus years. That's the life of those. So it brings a bit of I would say paranoia in me from a standpoint.
Yeah.
I think I was good if I can jump in. It's kind of like in healthcare, because in healthcare we had the Electronic Records Act, which incentivized with millions of dollars healthcare providers to move from paper to digital, but there was no security in that conversation, and that's why we're in the situation we're in today, because that never was built in from the beginning. So.
Right. Any other sector considerations? How about telecom? How about manufacturing? I mean, those two areas are also.
It's hard, and not from the perspective of that. It's the same issues you always have. Business wants lowest cost provider, and that's a driving force. Unfortunately, when you get the lowest cost provider, you're not getting nice features in some cases like that. And that's a business conversation you actually have to have. And it's not anything else, it's just the same thing, this is where we've driven companies. It's not from anything else. I think one of the bigger things that you get into is the world of legacy. It's like how much technical cybersecurity debt these organizations have.
Yeah.
And we never measure that when we're working with a vendor or anything else. What technical debt do you actually have on that side of it? And I think that's part of the issues that you're running into. And I think this is why you end up with subsidies and everything else being given to companies and organizations, because they realize the debt is so huge, you will never fix this problem. I've got to take on that thing, and you've seen it now. Attackers, ransomware groups, probably 3.5 months ago, started focusing on logistical organizations, because manufacturers can produce whatever they want to produce, unless there's somebody to be able to ship it. It's just going to sit there, and it doesn't sit there long because you got to turn on the factory because I got stuff everywhere. Everybody's on demand kind of manufacturing, and if it's not going out the door, I have to stop production. And I think that's where they will find those little key components of that. And then again, if you lose a provider, and this goes back to resiliency and some of the other stuff, how do I go back to when somebody's been hit? How do I know they're whole again? What's the requirement from that? It says, okay, you got hit. I did my due diligence. Turned you off. I'm not connected to you anymore. How do I reconnect? Or do I? Do I just say, well, there's smoke, there's fire, and we're going to burn down again? And I think that's, you get in a lot of those cases of it's crimes of opportunity, whether it is there and it's going to happen. And do you blame them? It's like, I had 2 people in cybersecurity, one's part-time, one's full-time, that's it. And yeah, that's a problem on that side of it. And yeah, it is an escalated problem. The higher up you're in here, the better you're at. And the attackers know. It's like, yeah, the reward's more. But do I really need the reward if I get 20 small organizations? Do I really need to go after the one big organization to be able to do it? And the likelihood of the payout is probably much greater than the rewards on that side of it. It's there. And they're going to do it. And I think this is the problem that we have, is that you're going back to the same thing. I was like, rock in a hard place. They don't have technical skills. There's not anybody helping them per se on that side of it. There's plenty of information, but to your point, every organization is very different. It's interconnectivity, what they have, how they function, where they connect to. They all sit there. And I think that's, everyone's a little slightly different, so there's no cookie cutter or anything else that's there. And again, you're not incentivized by the business a lot of times. I'm trying to make money. That's my goal. And when that's what your goal is, you're not going to win in cyberspace.
Yeah, because there is this physical limitation that's real, and yeah, I think again when we talk about supply chain, that becomes very, very real. Like, where do you stop production because you got hit, or stop production because somebody in your supply chain was moving that goods from Kuala Lumpur production area,
Exactly.
to Europe or wherever it and then comes here is hurt. Very good point there. So I'd like to wind up this particular segment with the takeaway, probably collective takeaway that there is need for investment into sharing from one sector to the other. There is also a need for investment of understanding each sector and where they stand with respect to their cybersecurity maturity. Because even if it's financial services, it's not doesn't mean that entire financial services stack is secure or mature. Then also investment into understanding this process of sharing very well, and what you do with that knowledge of information sharing, right? I think we have had quite a bit of reaction from many of those that are early adopters of large organizations in the sharing infrastructure, that we gave, but what do we get in return? So it's a little bit on the generosity of the super majors and large banks which do this. But how does it get used and what does it bring back value to the overall ecosystem is equally important, and that cuts across all critical infrastructure areas. So thank you for that and the thoughts around this topic. The next